Hi, so I'm excited to be here with an interview. It's going to be about neurodivergence and productivity. So, Yadir, would you like to introduce yourself and just share
Sure,
a bit about your interests?
sure. So my name is Yadir. I am by what I currently do for work is I work in uh, disability advocacy and services in California. So that's what I do kind of for my paycheck, but I also have a blog and a coaching business where I help neurodivergent individuals, particularly adults, navigate executive functioning issues and productivity, to just try to get more time in their day to enjoy things and not have to, spend so much time working and trying to figure things out. Um, but other than that, one of my lifelong interests is storytelling and fiction. So as a child, I was a huge bookworm. And like over time, that kind of evolved into interest in other things like anime and other TV shows, and now back circled back around to books. So I love anything storytelling and fiction, and I can get really, really absorbed into, what an interesting story is, like what different possibilities are, writing together with friends and stuff like that. But yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really excited to learn more about your productivity and storytelling as well. So I guess the second question on the list is just that, as you mentioned, you really specialized in helping neurodivergent people find tools and ways to self-accommodate their executive functioning. And
Mhm.
um, I guess I was first hoping to ask you about what advice you'd give to parents of younger neurodivergent or autistic children for how they can best support their child in developing self-advocacy and self-accommodation.
Yeah. Um, I think in particular for parents, um, I cannot overstate enough how important teaching like self-knowledge is, like helping young people learn about themselves and find value in what they learn about themselves. Like the best tools that especially neurodivergent kids can have is understanding who they are, what they like, what is important to them, and what accommodations they need. And that is a long journey of exploration because they're not going to find that in kind of like the overall world, because like the rest of the world and the rest of society is going to tell them, well, this is what you should need, or this is what everybody else needs. And that's more than likely not going to match up with them. So, fostering a curiosity in what is true for them, and helping and guiding them through that is probably one of the best things you could do, when they're young, because that way they'll be able to self accommodate in the future and will be able to communicate what they need without kind of the added pressure and self doubt that most kids will experience living in a neurotypical world.
That's such a good point, especially because I think so often the society's goal for accommodation is to have fewer and fewer accommodations and then eventually not to need accommodations at all, which is probably not what's going to be healthiest for children. Do you have any, I guess, guidance or suggestions on how parents can help their child start learning about what accommodations they need the most, especially because, as you mentioned, that isn't something that there's a lot of resources on.
Yeah, I think it's tough, right? Like there's a huge mismatch between like what the person needs and like what the rest of the world is set up for.
Yeah.
And I think it just starts with being curious and asking lots of questions, right? Like having like sit down and talk with your kids and like ask them like, what do you do? And like ask them like, do you have troubles with this? Like ask specific questions too. Like, I mean, in addition to being autistic, like I'm also nearsighted, right? So like I didn't know that I couldn't see until a doctor told me you can't see. Like, and that's true for other things too, right? Like that's true for all kinds of disability. Just like vision impairment is a disability. Like it's true with all kinds of disability. Like you don't know what you don't know. You don't know, what you might be struggling with if you haven't had a like a point of comparison, right? And sometimes it especially with kids, like I think we assume that people would know if something is wrong. But kids don't have the experience to be able to make that judgment. Um, I've heard stories of like the kids with worse visual impairments, like growing up and like not realizing until years down the line that what they were experiencing was different than somebody else. And so, especially with young kids, it's just like it's asking and being curious and observing, um, and recalling, right? Like I think adults tend to forget very quickly what our own childhood was like.
Yeah, that's
Like
a
we
really good
have
point.
we have the experience. Like we know what it was like being in school. We know what it was like being a kid. We just don't often think back on that. Um, and so like we have, I think, the starting tools. Like we obviously don't know exactly what's going on in their classroom or things like that, but we have the starting tools to be like, okay, like when I was in school, these are the kinds of things that happened. Let me ask my kid about like what their experience is with these things. Um, and ask them questions about like, hey, how is this part going? Like, how do you feel about this? What are you enjoying the most? What's hard or what's really frustrating? And like go through that and like just slowly tease out like what are the obstacles that they're facing. Because if especially finding patterns, right? Like if you find that they are struggling again and again and again in a certain field, like say they're struggling with reading or English class, like, hey, that might mean something, right? Like we might, you might be dealing with dyslexia, or it might be just like, there might be a reading comprehension, there might be other kinds of accommodations you could explore. And there's probably some answers there. So like, again, being very curious. Um, and asking lots of questions about like what they're experiencing and not assuming that the issues will just naturally float to the top, because that doesn't usually happen.
That makes a lot of sense, especially what you mentioned about. I think so often there is something that we don't know, and then we're maybe not even aware that we don't know it. So this
Yeah.
method seems like it could probably be
I mean,
helpful.
I didn't know I was autistic until I was like in my
Yeah.
20s. Um, like I didn't have the tools to like identify what my differences were. Like, and like, sure, maybe there are clues, but it's not always enough. And especially when like the rest of the world around you insists that like you must be normal, or insists that like everything is normal until it's not. Like there's so much pressure to be like everyone else that it makes it really hard to identify when you're not.
Yeah, and I feel like for most things, there's kind of this textbook case of it that everyone is expected to fit into. It's like
Yeah,
with autism, we have all the stereotypes that we're supposed to be
absolutely.
carrying our giant train collections around and stuff, and then
Right. Yeah, that's so true too, right? Like, and that's when it, especially when it comes to anything that has a name, right? Anything that is like a named disability or disorder, like there is, like you said, there's this textbook definition and what everybody expects that to look like. So when you have that, then that's what people are looking for. People aren't looking for anything else. So all the other things, and there's a lot that just gets swept under the like umbrella of um weird, right?
yes.
Just a little weird. And like I personally grew up like being proud of being weird, because like my family was such that like we were like, yeah, we're all a little weird and it's cool and we're fine with it. And like that was a pretty good experience for most of my like early childhood, because like I didn't let bullies get to me because they're like, oh, you're weird. I'm like, uh-huh. And um but but that doesn't protect you from everything. um and for a lot of people, like that's not a protection at all, right? Like bullies don't, like they always say, like bullies don't bully you because you're autistic, they bully you because you're weird. They don't have to know that you're disabled to target you. And so things like that. And also like struggles, like you're going to struggle regardless of whether or not you have a label of a disability. The struggle's still going to happen. And it's like the fact that if it doesn't have a name, or if we can't name it, sometimes things just get ignored because we're like, well, it doesn't seem big enough, it doesn't seem bad enough, it's not interfering enough. So like being curious of like, if you see your kid is struggling in some way, like be curious about it, try to figure out like, okay, what's happening here. Where is this coming from? What is the root cause of this? And like, it doesn't have to lead to a diagnosis. You can just accommodate individual struggles.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. Um, this wasn't on the question list, but I'm just curious your thoughts. And no pressure first, but something I've sort of heard from parents is that there can be this fear of having a diagnosis or a label attached to their child. And I think it comes from the place of they might hope that not putting a stigmatizing label on their child will protect their child from the stigma typically associated with it. But as you mentioned, whether you're identified as autistic or not, people will likely still be picking up on the social differences attached to that and will likely still respond with the stigma of autism, even if they don't specifically have that label.
Yeah.
So I was just curious what your thoughts are on ensuring that children know what their diagnoses are versus
Mhm.
maybe shying away from labeling a child.
Yeah. I think like one point that you were talking about, like that we were just talking about a
Mm,
second ago, which is that, especially if the disability has a social aspect, which a lot of them do, um, not having a label is not a protection. Like I said, like kids don't need a label. If there's a bully, like they don't need a label to target someone. Like that's not a protection, whether it's there or not. Um, I think there. So like personally, I think that having a label or a diagnosis can be really empowering.
mm,
Like my personal opinion is that it can be very empowering because it gives you context. It allows you to connect with others who are like you, to find solutions together, to get advice. There's all kinds of benefits to it. In the like social realm, I think there are pros and cons. um, I think there are different sets of struggles that come with either having the label or not having the label. um, not having the label just means that people are going to call you weird. Not having a label can mean that people just blame you, think it's a character flaw, blame you for not being able to do something, and a lot of that gets internalized, right? Like that's a big part of my experience, especially as a teenager. Is like I internalized my struggles, and I was like, I'm a failure. Like I can't do this, and it's fully my fault. And in fact, like one of my major fears about looking for like help in like mental health when I was a teenager was like, what if I go and they tell me nothing's wrong with you? Like I wasn't afraid, or I think I was afraid of either extreme, right? I was afraid they're gonna give me a label that's gonna stigmatize me. They're gonna say, oh, you're crazy, like you should be locked up. Like that's one extreme. But the other extreme was just as terrifying to me personally as a teenager of like, what if they tell me that there's nothing wrong with me? If they tell me there's nothing wrong with me, that means that it's all my fault, that it's my personal failure. And that is super damaging. So like I think that the argument of having a label versus not having a label, I think on one end, like the bullying side of it, like I think that that's wrong. Like I think that's not accurate, that like that and not having a label will protect you. And on the side of struggles, I think there's just a different set of struggles. Like not having a label means that there's a chance you might internalize a lot. And having a label, yeah, of course, it opens you up to some stigma. It opens you up to, like people, again, people have these stereotypes about what something is supposed to be. So if you fit them, then they'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. If you don't fit them, then you're constantly like, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. Like that you're not this. And then you're constantly having to like defend yourself or whatever. um but yeah, I think there's pros and cons, but I do still believe that like the pros of having access to information and a community probably outweigh the cons.
Thank you. That's actually really helpful answer for me as well. Yeah, something I found is that in my child's case, sometimes when places that we might be exploring for him that are like kid-oriented spaces,
Mhm.
um, if they reject him or immediately express discomfort or questions about whether they can accommodate him on the basis of the label. Um, that is something that happens, and
Mm.
for a while it was making me wonder if
Well,
maybe
actually,
that label is okay. But then I realized that probably they wouldn't be accommodating places for him anyways.
mm,
You know,
that's true.
if they're going to reject the label of autism, they probably wouldn't be set up to accommodate or accept the differences of autism. He might just be able to get in there for an initial group, but then
Yeah,
face all the stigma. And
it
so,
wouldn't work
yeah,
out in the end.
yeah, but
Yeah, actually, like that brings up an interesting point, which is like, I think there's a difference between like having the label or like, having a diagnosis or your kid knowing what the diagnosis is and then using that to get accommodations. Like
yeah,
in an ideal world, you could be like, oh, here's, they have this condition or whatever. And like, that's fine. And you won't have to deal with stigma attached to that. You won't have to be immediately rejected. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in, right? In the world we live in, that is a problem. And I have found and I have heard from others that like sometimes it's just easier to just ask for the accommodation and not mention the label, right? So like the label is for us. The label is for us. It's not for other people. The label is for us to connect with our communities. It's not for other people. It's not for their benefit. Um, and I think that's where like a lot of the contention comes from. It's like people think of like, oh, people so, like getting a label means other people are labeling me, and it's just like that's not the point of view here. Like the thing is like the label is for me. The label is a tool for me. It's not for other people to put on me. Um, and when it comes to like asking for accommodations, unfortunately, it's sometimes more effective to be like, okay, my kid needs this, and like not mention a label. And sometimes like they'll be like, okay, yeah, we can do that. And they'll just be like, hey, my kid struggles with this particular thing. Can you help them with A, B, or C? And then sometimes they'll be like, okay, yeah, we can do that. And then just not mention a label. Um, yeah, there's a chance that they might still, down the line still might not work out because there's other factors that maybe we didn't account for. Or if you say like, okay, here's a bunch of different things that they need, sometimes they'll be like, oh, well, there's too many things.
yeah,
So,
yeah, I
we don't
get
want to do that.
that.
But like you said, like it's not a matter of the label. It's a matter of like they were never willing to accommodate in the first place. It doesn't matter what the label is. And another thing that like has come up recently, it just like in people I've been talking to is that the idea that if you don't label your child that they'll somehow be able to surpass it, right? That like that a label is somehow limiting. And I personally have a huge problem with this idea, right? That like the label is somehow limiting because it means like, I don't know, I think people believe that if you accept a diagnosis, if you accept that you're disabled, that you are limiting yourself, that you are giving up. And that's just not the case. Like that's just not true. It's an explanation. It's an understanding of like, oh, this is who I am and this is what I'm working through, this is what I'm struggling with, this is what I deal with, this is my reality. um, and I think that trying to put the onus on disabled people, especially children, to like overcome it is cruel. Like it's not their fault. It is not a personal failing. They don't have a responsibility to overcome it. Um, and I think fundamentally people do their best. Um, and I think like when people like if people are not doing well, it's not because they're not doing their best, it's because they're struggling.
Thank you. Those are really good points. I kind of asked a bunch of tangential questions because it's really interesting what you're saying. The third question I had, kind of jumping back to the list, is on neurodivergent productivity. So I was reading some of your articles on different perfects, and I was really interested in them. And one quote that I was especially interested in, you wrote, disabled productivity is about riding the line between an external demand for productivity and understanding our inherent worth as human beings. Um, and a little later on, you wrote it's about learning how to survive and maybe even thrive in a world that is designed to leave us behind. So I was wondering if you could just kind of expand on this a little bit more, both the concept of it and then also whether you have suggestions for disabled or neurodivergent adults who might be watching this on how they could maybe start learning about implementing disabled productivity in their lives.
Yeah. the idea of disabled productivity just came from like just a personal like conflict and question that I am just constantly working on because before I got my diagnosis, I had been really interested in like productivity and like productivity apps and like techniques and stuff like that because I was trying to figure out something that will help me because I was in college and I was struggling. The executive functioning was kicking my butt and I was struggling. And I was like, what thing out there, what tool, what technique is going to solve my problem? And the answer is that there isn't a tool or technique that's going to solve all your problems. But I got really into that space and I got really interested in like all of those different tools and techniques because they were interesting. And there's just I don't know, I got it became an interest of mine. But after I got my diagnosis and I started slowly entering the realm of disability, and listening to other people talk about it, I realized that there's a fundamental conflict between productivity and disability. Um, because productivity is all about like, you should do more. Um, and when you get into disability rights, it's just like people are not what they create. Like our worth is not based on what we can produce. And it is a fundamentally anti-capitalist view because like we are more than what we produce and we live in a society unfortunately that values us based on what we can produce. And so these two ideas are fundamentally opposed. And so I'm just constantly kind of tackling with this question of like, how do these two coexist? Or do they, or what does that look like? And one of the things that I came to is just the thing is that there's the ideal world and then there's reality. In an ideal world, nobody has to work to be allowed to live, right? Like we live in a society where if you don't work, you are left to die. And fundamentally, our society doesn't care about individuals that way. But we know that that should not be the case. We know that in an ideal world, if people cannot work, that's fine, and they are still allowed to live, and they are still cared for, and they can still have what they need to not only survive but thrive and have a good life. Um, and so that's the ideal. But the reality is that we live in a society that doesn't think that way, and nothing is set up for us to do that. And so we just have to survive. And so in the meantime, while there are people working towards that better future and reaching that ideal someday, we still have to survive today. And so my current goal and my current position on disabled productivity is that there has to be a way to use these tools that people have created to get things done in less time with less energy, not so you can do more things, but so you can rest and so you can live your life and work less. And so the goal for me when it comes to disabled productivity is to work less and live more and rest more, and not to just continuously do more things, and also just to survive because that ideal world, we're not there yet, and in the meantime we're still here.
Yeah. I feel like sometimes, I guess I don't know how broadly shared this experience is, but for autistic people, especially going through school and often having a lot of stigma, there can be this pressure to sort of overcompensate for that by being really productive,
Mm.
all the time. Is that something that you've seen a lot with the clients that you work with? Um, or
Yeah, I think there's definitely part of that. It really is, it's so individual. Like it's
Mhm.
the thing with neurodivergence is that every individual is so completely different from the next.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think it can present in a lot of ways. But I think that part of what happens, especially if you grow up internalizing ideas that you're not enough, that you're not doing well, that you're not trying hard enough. Because, like, especially for ADHD kids, like, the biggest thing that they hear growing up is you're not trying hard enough. You're smart, but you're not trying hard enough.
Right.
And people internalize that, right? And so they feel this need to like constantly work and work harder, and they internalize the idea that they're not doing enough, and that if only they did better, if only they worked harder. And that's just not true. Um, it's not true, and it's really harmful. And it takes so much work to unlearn that. And I've experienced that with my clients. Like it takes a long time. And part of what I do is trying to help people unlearn that, because it does a lot of damage, and it prevents us from being able to heal and being able to find healthier ways to get our work done and survive, without all the added pressure.
That makes sense. So I guess I think I kind of understand how the concept of disabled productivity is very different from standard productivity, which is to just do as much as possible,
Yeah.
produce as much as possible. How does that kind of filter into the way that you approach the methods that you use for productivity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So um, the way I think about it is that I take a systems building approach. So what that means is there are a lot of tools and techniques out there. And my goal is not to say this is what you should do. It's to learn about who you are, what's important to you, what you want to accomplish, and how you work, right? And to find the best tools for the job. So everybody works differently. Everybody has different styles. Everyone has different ways that their brains process information. Everybody has different just like within executive skills, you know, depending on which model you're looking at, there's like between 8 and 12 different executive
Oh,
skills.
wow.
So
That's
just in
interesting.
that, there's there are so many different things that we could be looking at. And so my goal is to be like, okay, there's lots of tools. We're going to try to find what tools work best. But more than just tools, we want to build a system, a scaffolding that can support you and the work you're trying to do, and can help you reach your goals, whatever they are, by providing the structure that you need, by making the hard things easier. And it's meant to be completely personalized. So, you know, like I said, the productivity thing was a huge interest of mine for a long time. So I've learned about a bunch of different things. There's always new things to learn out there too. And it's really about like, hey, sometimes it's going to be trial and error. Sometimes through conversation, I can kind of figure out like, okay, well, this might work better than this other thing. But a lot of it is going to be trial and error. And the goal is to build something, some kind of structure, some support system to help make things easier. And that is always going to be very individual, because what people struggle with is different. And what their styles are different. Like all of those things are different. So I take just a very individualized approach. And also like I try to take a holistic approach, because all these different things are connected. If you have executive functioning issues and struggles, it's not only going to affect you at school and at work. It's also going to affect you at home. It's going to affect your relationship. It's going to affect everything. So we can't just talk about work. We can't just talk about school. And so I try to zoom out, try to be more holistic, and also be very individual about my approach, which is why I style it more as like coaching. It's a process. It's like we got to talk pretty often. We got to keep working at it. We got to tweak things here and there. And in the process, hopefully build the skills so that they can continue to do that tweaking into the future, because it's not a one-time thing. It's not okay, we found the solution, now you're set.
That would be
People
awesome.
change, life changes. Like it is not like set it and forget it. Like it takes work to maintain and to tweak, and so there are skills to build. But that's my approach, and how I try to build it for the individual, and for what they want to accomplish.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like a really neat process as well. So my last question on the list is sort of an extension of this, where I'm just wondering what your own experience has been as a late diagnosed autistic person and how you found your passions and interests in productivity and storytelling and anything else, and maybe how they've applied to your own life as well.
Yeah. I think it was actually pretty hard for me to figure out what my interests were. I think like a lot of my life I've been very like distance from myself. Um, and I spent a long time even after college trying to figure out what I wanted to do and what I wanted to spend my time doing, what kind of career I wanted, and all of those things. Like if the answers to that felt so far away for so long. Um, and what it took for me was number one, getting my autism diagnosis, because it it started answering so many questions that I had always had. Like my understanding of myself just like skyrocketed. Like in retrospect, like I knew very little about myself. I understood very little about myself. And after figuring it out and then getting the official diagnosis, I started to understand myself a lot better. Um, and that allowed me to do the kind of self-reflection that I hadn't been able to do before. And suddenly all of these answers seemed very simple. And I think I just like I didn't have the tools and I hadn't allowed myself to trust my own answers. So for example, I didn't I couldn't tell you like at the age of 20, like I couldn't tell you the big love of my life is storytelling. It was true. It's been true my whole life, but I couldn't tell you that. I wouldn't have been able to say that. And the way I discovered it is that at some point after discovering I was autistic and thinking about the idea of special interests, I just started reflecting. I was just like, what is the common thread? Because it's like, what is the common thread among all of the things that I've ever really, really loved and been super into? And as soon as I asked myself that question, it became glaringly obvious, right? Because it's like, what is like my first obsession was books. My first ever like thing that I could not let go of was like I was a huge bookworm as a young child. Um, and eventually that faded away. And I think as a kid, I internalized the idea that like, oh, my interests all fade away. And then what? Like, what if I do something and then I lose interest in it? Then, and that's like a whole different thing. But the thing is that there was this common thread. Yeah. It went from, okay, it was books. And then later it was like anime. And then later it was like, I mean, I got into anime, I got really into manga, and that still is a huge interest of mine. I'm getting now back into books. In between that, I also got really into like role-playing games like D&D and watching actual plays online, um, and listening to podcasts about things like that. And the thing is that all of these things have a huge common denominator, which is storytelling. Like the thing that I love and have always loved is just a good story. Um, and yeah, all it took was me being able to ask the question of like, hey, is there a common thread here? And there was. Um, as for like the like neurodivergent and productivity side, I think that was a very different journey for me. Um, I felt so strongly about that process of getting to know myself that I at the same time, like after my diagnosis, fortunately, I had the time to be like, okay, let me try to build a system for myself. Let me try to build a support system for myself so that I can go on and do the things I want to do. Um, and and that was hard work because I didn't really have any help. I was seeing a therapist, and like unfortunately, that there was not a lot of help in the kind of practical sense here. Um, and so I did a lot of it by myself. And at some point, I was just like, hey, if I'm doing this by myself, why don't I might as well apply what I'm learning to other people. I might as well help other people who are also going through this journey. So really, my interest in kind of disabled productivity, what ended up being disabled productivity or neurodivergent productivity, started as like, hey, I'm going through all this trouble anyway. Like, I'm doing all this research, I'm doing all this work anyway. It might as well benefit somebody else too. Um, and that's why I started with like adult neurodivergence, um, especially people who are diagnosed as adults, right? Or people who have had a diagnosis but have never been able to get that support system in place, because that's what I have the best understanding of right now, because that's been my experience. And my hope is in the future I can also work with teens and kids in school, like young teens, because I think that that's a really great opportunity to build those systems when school is starting to get more and more complicated, before they go off to college or whatever else they're going to do, work and stuff. Um, but for right now, my focus is on neurodivergent adults, um, because we're struggling out here.
Yeah.
And I might as well put what I've learned, to benefit somebody else.
That's really neat. I think it's yeah, I think your work is really really neat overall. Um, I'm wondering, kind of speaking of the school system, are there specific supports that you wish were available when you were in school?
That's a great question. Um, yeah, especially like after, I would say like after I feel like my struggles in school like just evolved. Like when my struggles as like an elementary school kid were so vastly different from my struggles as a high schooler.
Yeah.
Um, but I think like especially like middle school, high school, executive functioning was kicking my butt. I was procrastinating on everything. I would forget what my homework assignments were. Um, I was so stressed. I was unbelievably stressed out, especially like at the end of the semester or like for finals or for we had, as a senior, we had like a thesis project and everything was left until the last minute. Um, and I was just in constant state of panic, writing essays at 4 in the morning. Like it was terrible. Like I was miserable. And I was blaming myself. And the thing is that like if I had someone who could have walked me through and been like, okay, you're overwhelmed. Let's break this down. And who could identify what the struggles I had were. And the thing is that like personally, my grades were amazing. I graduated, I think, seventh in my class.
Mm.
Like my grades were great. So no one would have imagined how much I was struggling and how much stress I was constantly under. And so like my dream for the future for kids in schools is that there is a built-in system for making sure that kids are learning the skills that they need to build, because like we had something, right? There's always like there's some, there's like homeroom and there's this other thing called avid where it was like supposed to teach you how to organize your stuff, but it was very like regimented. It was like a one answer kind of thing and it just didn't work for me. And I think there's just, there's the whole issue of just like schools don't have enough funding, there's not enough teachers, like there aren't enough teachers to go around to be able to give each student the attention that they need. And I think this is an issue for more than just neurodivergent kids, right? Like neurotypical kids struggle with the same types of things. Um, and if only there had been someone who could have been like, hey, I can tell you're overwhelmed, you're procrastinating, you're stressed out. Let's figure out how to lessen the overwhelm, how to lessen the anxiety so that you're not procrastinating, because that's what procrastination is. It's anxiety. Um, and like helped me break things down and plan things ahead of time and worked with me to like learn how to take notes. Like I've never learned how to study or how to take notes, which was a whole thing in college. It was tough, but the executive functioning piece is the biggest thing in my experience, and so that's why it's been my focus, and why like if I were going to go into schools or work with schools in the future, to help kids, especially like in high school, it would be focused in executive functioning skills and identifying what kids are struggling with and giving them tools to make things at least less stressful, but it would probably also improve their grades.
And I think your answer also, at least from my perspective, it kind of highlights the need for schools to redefine what struggling means. Because so often I've heard that
That's a
schools will
really
wait to
good point.
see sort of quantitative struggling defined by someone's grades. And then if someone's continuing to have good grades or yeah, really good grades in your case, it will be assumed that the person's doing fine, but that may not be the perspective of the person who's actually living through that experience,
Absolutely.
which is also very
That's a
important to
really good
consider.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like I think that part of that is that, our school system is not designed to think of students as people.
Mhm.
Like students are students, not people, and not individuals who have needs and lives outside of school. They're just students. And so when they're just students, grades are the ultimate um, data point. What's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. Like grades are the ultimate thing that they're tracking and are interested in. Nothing else really matters. But if before being students, they're people, then having regular check-ins, I like trying to figure out like what are their stress levels at. Are they eating well? Are they sleeping well? What worries do they have about their future? What worries do they have at home? Like all of those things are way more important, first of all, but also like would be way more indicative of whether or not they're struggling. Because yeah, exactly, like grades are not indicative of struggling because I was struggling, but my grades did not reflect that. And that's where a lot of people fly under the radar. Um, and it works the other way too, right? Like tons of people who have poor grades, it also means that their strengths get overlooked. Like I'm sure every single person who's had poor grades has strengths that were overlooked because the system was not set up to identify those things. They're only set up to look at grades. So yeah, I think that's a great point that um, we're not looking for those other things in schools, and we should be.
Um, I think that's all the questions on the list, but I just want to thank you so much again for coming and sharing your knowledge and experience. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
of
was
course.
learning a
This
lot
was
from
fun.
talking with you. So thank you. And I'll put a link
Yeah, you're
at the
welcome.
bottom of your website for people who are interested in looking at that.
Awesome.
So,
Thank you.